Right, our next session will be a panel discussion on climate accounting. We look at how a global ecosystem consisting of private and public actors can leverage on technology to instill trust and transparency for better impact measurement and ultimately mobilize greater investments. Moderating this panel of experts is Brian Cahill, Global Head of Environmental, Social and Corporate Governance at Moody's Investors Service. He'll be joined by Martin Wainstein, founder and lead scientist at Yale Open Innovation Lab. Gaelle, Olivier, Societe Generale's APEC Chief Executive Officer, and Fidelity International's Global Head of Stewardship and Sustainable Investing, Jenn-Hui. Let's head on over to Brian to hear the discussion around climate accounting.
Great, thank you very much, and welcome everyone, and I appreciate you making the time to join us. So the context for this panel on climate accounting is that essentially we are seeing that climate data and records are typically residing in disparate systems and platforms that are unlinked, resulting in high levels of inefficiency and time lag in data reporting. And yet at the same time, financial markets are struggling with the complexity of understanding climate models, climate impact, and linking it to assessing the financial implications for their investment decisions. But if we want to drive private capital to support climate mitigation and adaptation, this risk assessment, this linking between climate models and their hazards implications and financial implications, this linking needs to happen quickly. So the theme for the panel today is, can we establish a global climate modeling and data ecosystem comprising private and public sector actors and leverage on technology to instill trust and transparency for better impact measurement and ultimately mobilize greater investments? We will endeavor to take questions as we go along. We only have a small amount of time, so apologies if we don't get to all of them. My panelists have been introduced already, and I think I'll just jump straight into the first question, which is really a foundational question. And I thought before we get into the details of how we might change things, we might define what we mean by climate accounting. What are we trying to measure and for whom? And for that, I'm going to ask Martin to lead us off and cover from his perspective the definitional aspects of climate accounting, and then ask my other panelists to give their perspective. So to you, Martin.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. It's such a pleasure and honor to join the three of you in such an important, timely topic as you've introduced as well, Brian. The way that I normally frame climate accounting is climate action happens in the real world. Climate accounting needs to happen in the digital world, and it represents the records of every action that an actor takes that either has an effect on the climate or the impacts of climate change. And we can break it down to the segment that we normally are familiar with, which is carbon accounting, both our emissions, but also our mitigations. But it's not just carbon. It also involves adaptation to climate change, the financing of actions that both turn to emissions mitigation and adaptation, as well as the accountability to the pledges that actors set and their progress towards meeting those pledges. And I would say that I like to think about that whole family of carbon and non-carbon as climate accounting.
Great, thank you, Martin. And Gaelle, I might turn to you from the financial sector's perspective. What do we think about, or what do you think about as climate accounting? What's important from your perspective? Gaelle, I think you might be on mute.
Thank you, Brian. Okay. I'm very happy to be with all of you in the discussion. For us in the financial sector, this topic has gained importance over the past years, and I see more and more financial services industries putting this at the core of their strategy, and I think that's what we are doing at Societe Generale. It's very important that we start to measure what we are doing. That's what Martin was mentioning regarding the carbon footprint. I think it goes beyond this. It's about whether our data is consistent. We make it available both for us in-house, but also outside for external parties. And for this, that's a key challenge because we see that there are many different accounting regulations all over the world. So there's first and foremost a challenge of identifying where the data sits, making sure the data is relevant, making sure the data is consistent, and making sure that with the data, we drive our businesses towards a big impact towards climate change. It's regarding carbon footprint, but not only. I think there's a lot that we can start to measure and monitor on where we finance, for instance, our businesses. Do we finance towards renewable energy transition, towards building a more sustainable planet? And I think these are areas where more and more we are measuring where we put our money, how we put our money, and for the benefit of which type of players. And I guess this is something that all of us as financial services organizations, we need to continue to strive to do and combine our efforts to make it as much as possible a consistent framework.
Great, thank you very much, Gaelle. Jen, I think when we talked before, you mentioned that climate accounting is part of the way that you think about integrating ESG issues into Fidelity investment decisions. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you're doing that?
Sure. Good morning, Brian, and good morning, everyone, and great to be here. I guess sort of just taking one step back a little bit, when I think about climate accounting as an investor, what I'm thinking about is that the financial statements and accounts of all the companies we invest in should be reflecting assumptions that are consistent with the Paris Agreement. So in other words, they are Paris-aligned accounts. And I think companies have a basic obligation to ensure that their financial statements reflect all the material information about climate-related risks. So to use a simple example, they should be valuing assets using assumptions that are compatible with a sustainable climate, and they should be taking impairments to reflect the appropriate climate risks to their business models. And I want to sort of emphasize that, we're talking a lot about sort of really interesting, cool developments here, but a lot of these basic building blocks already exist, right? There's no reason why companies today shouldn't be doing that in their accounts. And I think the IASB has already made it clear that, in its opinion, the current IFSR rules do require an assessment of climate-related risks in their financial statements. And it emphasizes the materiality of that disclosure according to investor concerns. So I think that's something that, without thinking about the long-range challenges that Martin's talking about, we should be encouraging companies to do today. And I think the second piece of that puzzle then is, what is the role of auditors in that? Because the role of auditors is really to provide external assurance that the accounts do reflect all these material risks, and that the statements that they're signing off on reflect climate risks, and they reflect the transparency of assumptions behind that as well. So they should only be signing off statements when they're confident that these accounts do that. And so I think auditors have that key role to play. But I think the final piece of the puzzle is us as the investors as well. Because whilst I can talk about the need for companies to do this, to the extent they're not doing this, investors need to be reflecting our own view of climate risk into companies, building them into our own assessments, because it is already very apparent that climate risk is a very significant financial risk to the companies that we invest in, and we wouldn't be doing our job as asset managers, as fiduciaries of our clients, if we weren't already doing this. So there's a lot of great tools that I think Gaelle and Martin have already talked about. There's good carbon accounting tools out there. There's carbon footprinting. There's scenario analysis. There's an assessment of the climate liability risk that accrues to companies. There's an assessment of their overall resiliency of their physical assets. I think all of these things can and should be done already by investors. I would say the most important of the things that we need to do is an assessment of a company's overall transition and strategy towards a net zero future. Investors increasingly will need to make judgments about where companies are positioned for this coming transition, which we all know is going to be extremely significant, which companies are going to succeed and which companies are going to fall by the wayside. Mark Carney made a really, I think, fascinating comment, which I think I wholeheartedly agree with. He said that by the time COP26 comes next November, the absence of a transition plan by a company is either going to be seen as an intention that the company will be wound down in the coming decades, or that in some way this company stands apart from society. And I think if you don't fall into either of those two categories, then climate accounting is something that companies need to be addressing now.
Jen, thank you. A lot of what you touched on, I think, is around impact, right? So you're talking about assessing risk and choosing organisations that you feel are aligned, in particular around climate risk, right, with the transition pathway. So how are you doing that? How are you trying to actually assess the transition pathways, if you like, the impact companies are having in being aligned with the Paris Agreement? And there's a lot of complexity in that, but I'd be very interested in your perspective on that.
So it's really only something that you can do at an individual company level, right? I think it's something that we feel management is best placed to do. One of Mark Carney's ideas, which we also support, is for investors to have a say on climate. So we're all very familiar with investors having a say on pay, where we vote quite regularly on their REM plans, and we ensure that executives are paid in a way that aligns them to long-term stakeholder and shareholder concerns. And I think that the need for investors to focus on climate speaks to that need for investors to have a formal mechanism to opine on whether or not we think a company's transition plan is frankly adequate. You can only kind of do that by looking at the company itself, looking at, some companies may take a view which is not unreasonable, that the company should be managed into a runoff state. We know that at the moment, looking at how our energy grids are set up, how our agricultural grids are set up, some companies simply won't exist by the time we reach 2030. Those business models are not compatible with the sustainable environment that we're talking about. And so these companies need to be managed in a responsible way into a runoff situation, whereas other companies can pivot their business models in a way that meets that decarbonized future. So I think kind of working with companies, investors using our influence to engage with company management, either as owners of these businesses or as lenders of these businesses, and helping them to come up with our views on what we think that transition strategy looks like. That, I think, is the responsibility for the institutional investor community.
Thank you. And Gaelle, obviously the French financial system and the French political systems are at the forefront of leading in thinking about how to transition to a safer world from a climate perspective. So how is your bank going about assessing these issues that Jen just raised around risk and impact assessment?
Thank you, Brian. I think what I've seen very interesting over the past few years is that the banks have realized that the solution will not come from them acting as an individual organization, but also joining their forces. So we have a group of banks, which we call Katowice banks, who have combined together their expertise to define their trajectory in order to align as best as possible with the UN Paris Agreement, as an example. And I think it's very interesting to see that there is this collaborative thinking process in designing what can be the key actions that banks need to take in order to play their role as well in this net zero or reducing carbon footprint world. By aligning their methodologies, they are also aligned their objectives and at least their ambition. And I think it's a kind of peer-to-peer pressure that by joining forces, when you see that your competitor is taking courageous action, then you feel there's no reason why you should not do it as well. And when I look at what all the banks have, the key banks have expressed over the past years in terms of their own objectives, when I look at the European banks, notably, they are clearly leading the pack. I see the American banks are also starting to be extremely vocal, and so are the Asian banks. And what I found extremely strong during the past year is the fact that even in a world strongly impacted by the first ever pandemic, significant crisis, all the banks have reinforced their objectives and are continuing to monitor the progress they are making towards those objectives. So for us, Societe Generale, that's exactly what we are doing. We have actually raised the objectives we had in terms of raising funding to support energy transition. We have expressed a clear objective to reduce our exposure to thermal coal, to reduce our exposure to oil and gas extraction sector, to align our business project finance, notably on shipping, for instance, with less carbon intensive shipping. We have issued ETF in line with green bond financing and CSR or ESG, depending how you call it, principles. So many of our initiatives are now looked through the angle of climate change and the climate impact of what we are doing. We have issued reports which make it completely available for all our external parties to monitor and assess what we are doing and to challenge us in a constructive manner to see how we can do better. And the entire organization, from top to bottom, is now fully aligned with objectives at most senior executive level, fully aligned with the progress we are doing on climate change impact. I think it's for me a key step up versus 10 years ago, where the topic was mentioned, but probably not yet fully embarked deep inside the organization. I think now it's quite clear and obvious that the banks see it as their completely integral part of their own purpose and the way they want to do the financing going forward of the economies.
Great, thank you very much, Gaelle. So we spent the first half of our panel really just defining what climate accounting is. I do want to make sure we pivot to the topic about how we can use technology. Martin, I might come back to you, right? So we've kind of defined what we think climate accounting means, both in terms of impact on the climate and measuring that, and the way in which the financial sector wants to measure the way in which its actions are either contributing or reducing the impact of their lending decisions on the climate. So talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about what you think a system for climate accounting looks like. And perhaps also, while you're doing that, how can technology help? I think this is the core of this festival is around fintech. So I'd be very interested in your perspective on that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brian. And I probably my first comment there of what does a climate accounting system need? Well, it needs to be anchored on the physical state of the planet. And so the fundamental layer has to look at what's the state of the atmosphere. And it's because that layer is what defines the target set in Paris, 2 degrees with an effort to 1.5, which leaves a very specific carbon budget that's left. And it's that scarcity of the carbon budget where we ideally need to derive our pledges, our actions, and constantly iterate each year how we're doing vis-a-vis that the state of the atmosphere. So that's a very important part because it needs to bring in all of our information of our sensors, our global CO2 sensors, our integrative assessment models to constantly give a feedback of what us, the world actors, are doing, our countries, our companies, our supply chains in regards to the management of that global comment. Now, as soon as we dive into the world system and what every actor does in regards to that, this is where technology has a very important role. And I would probably classify it into 3 important aspects that a climate accounting system needs to have. The first one is what we define as nested climate accounting, which means that at a project level or supply chain level, that rolls up to the company that operates it. And a company normally has different, operates in different jurisdictions that tend to be subnational actors, like just cities, provincial regions, which have their own climate target. And those naturally roll up to the national level and the international level. So the logic of that is no matter where you are in the world and how you're accounting, that has to roll up to that international level because it has to connect to that atmospheric accounting. Now, that is where a lot of the technologies that we've been particularly working on in establishing Web3, so the evolution of the internet that can leverage spatially based information as a networking mechanism is quite critical. At the moment, the internet runs on IP addresses, which are stored in registries, and we just cross information between websites. I think in the future, we're going to be evolving a lot of some of the tools of the internet to be able to speak directly on what the physical world. The second important part is to be able to allow transparency, so fundamental climate transparency, which is an aspect of Paris, alongside data privacy. And this technology also, particularly in the last couple of years, has done a huge amount of progress, coming a lot from financial technology solutions. So math from cryptography, like zero-knowledge proof and homomorphic encryption, allows one to establish trust in the data that someone's providing without having access to the raw data set, and being able to also bring in different relationships of those auditors. And probably the last important aspect is interoperability. There is no way we can have a single centralized repository or ledger to keep track of everything I'm describing. It has to, like we talked at the beginning, different databases, different registries, different ledgers have to be able to speak the common language. And even if we think about data pouring into the system at the project level, this is where IoT sensors are very important. How do they integrate into common accounting processes? How can we audit that data streams? And particularly as we assetize data, meaning that either a company or an organization has a negative or a positive impact on climate, that and all the sources that are used to derive that trusted record is an asset. And the way that the data is framed in that asset needs to be able to be understood by all the actors. And so a lot of the work on digital data protocols and standards are crucial for that to happen.
Great, thank you very much, Martin. I want to pivot a little bit and talk from the financial sector's perspective about the importance of the solutions being compatible with their operations, right, and their commercial needs. Gaelle and perhaps Jen, I might ask you first how you think about how technology can help to drive the the changes that are required by the financial system.
So I think I think of this in sort of two ways, the role of the financial system. I think the first is in, most obviously providing the capital that helps to drive some of these climate positive investments that we know that we need to make, and that can be both around transitioning the existing stock of brown assets, and it can be about advancing the sort of frontiers of measurement and mitigation and adaptation solutions. But secondly, and I think even more importantly, we can be users of all of these tools. In fact, I think that's really our most important contribution, to bake it into the way in which we run and operate our own businesses. So, for example, something as simple as the TCFD, it already gives a very robust framework for the disclosure of financial risks. Fidelity published its first TCFD report just yesterday, notwithstanding that we're a private company and that we're not obliged to do that, because I think the obligation is now on all leading financial service actors to do what we are asking others to do, which is shine that light of transparency on our own business and our own approach and our own transition to net zero. So that's, I think, something that baking these tools in, using the ones that are available, engaging with the companies that we lend to or invest with to promote better disclosure, promote better thinking around strategy, good governance, metrics and targets. All of these things, I think, should be part of the way in which we go about doing our business now.
Great, thank you. Gaelle, what your perspective?
Yeah. I agree with both Martin and Jen. I think the new technologies are today an enabler for making these data consistent, available, transparent. We need to keep pragmatism in mind, because those new technologies can also build a very complex web of information if we don't keep common sense and pragmatism in mind. Very interesting that Jen mentioned the TCFD report, so the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. I would say Societe Generale does it as well and has already issued its report. I think we have already all the tools from the new technologies to translate these reports, which are text and numbers, into an available database, which would be available for all players wanting to look at banks and how they process their operations in a comparative basis. And I think the natural language processing, common repositories database would allow us to do that today at a limited cost and quite available resource for all. be them the banks or the external parties. I think that this is the next step, and it's not the next step not for 1 year from now, 10 years from now. It's the next steps for today and tomorrow, because all those tools today, they exist. It's more a matter of plugging them into those reports and making those reports available into a database usage. We have seen players already starting to look at their financials with integrating their carbon footprint into their financials and communicating on their results net of CO2 footprint. I think it's a big step forward where we start to see the combination of not only what you produce as an industry, but also the impact you have on the planet, combine the two and look at your net performance towards the planet as a combination or the net impact of your financial results minus your carbon footprint or your impact on the planet, so that you get, for the customers, but also for all your stakeholders, a net impact. And for this net impact to be relevant, so you need to be sure that it's consistent and looked at with pure numbers. And it goes back to the theme of financial accounting, because we need to make sure that those numbers behind, they have been proved, they are reliable, and stakeholders can look at them with enough comfort to be able to use them. But then in terms of new technologies, you can think at distribution of services, database, leverage blockchain. You can also think at leveraging what banks or all sectors are doing in their climate impact and giving them goodwills or good positive assets or points if they are making good progress in their trajectories, so that there is a kind of incentive to do well as well. And I think this is made available today by the technologies as they exist today. It's more a matter of using them the best way possible, and again with pragmatism, so that we don't end up into a too messy structure, which would not be which would be difficult to manage.
Thank you, Gaelle. I from my own experience within Moody's of trying to assess and measure climate risk for all of the thousands of rated entities that we cover, I agree with you that the technologies are there. I think they have a way to go in terms of evolving, and there is a lot of complexity in it. But to just catch on one of Jen's points, we ourselves have contributed by investing in a climate risk analytics firm and then actively working with them to figure out how we can use their services in our own rating analysis. So there's the sort of the capital investment and then the positive feedback of giving them a sense of what we as a private sector actor need from them to measure these risks in the financial sector. So I think there is a lot of that type of activity going on, and I agree with you, particularly in the banking system, given the regulatory oversight. There's a lot of initiatives. But we have very limited time left, perhaps 2 or 3 minutes. I might just ask Martin, perhaps from his perspective, what more do you think the public and private sector can do to make this assessment of climate impact using technology happen in a faster way?
Well, I think it's very important for us to be able to create pilots that bring in all the different stakeholders. The public sector that has its own, at the national level, its obligations to the Paris Agreement in terms of their nationally determined contribution, the subnationals as well in their regulatory jurisdictions, and the private sector that really show, particularly our conversation, the myriad of actors that need to align. Let's say a company that has operations on the ground, the investor that has to bring in capital to the company and analyze risk, as well as organizations that represent different stakeholder groups as well. They have to come together to align how they're going to talk about climate and risk. So it's very important to bring in a lot of those efforts, and particularly as we're understanding what from the different technologies need to come together and integrating common frameworks. Those pilots are very, very relevant, and they need to be live, so not just proof of concepts. And that's important because one of the most important things that the technology has to do is reduce the cost of accounting. If accounting for all of this is extremely expensive for everyone will resist it. And this is something that we need to do almost at real time. And that's the big challenge, of course.
Thank you, Martin. And this concept of pilots, I agree with. I just outline a little bit the way we're doing it with affiliates. But Gaelle, I think really what you outlined with the idea of the banks coming together is a bit of a piloting of their collective wisdom, if you like. Jenna, is there something you could share about how you think about that from the Fidelity perspective? I know we talked earlier about both investing and using tools, but are there specific, to the extent you could share them, specific pilots that you are involved in, your institution is involved in, that are trying to leverage public and private pilots and improve the technology solutions?
Yeah, I think, and actually, I'm quite optimistic, because I think this 2021 is clearly going to be the year, I think, which 2020 should have been for climate, where we'll see that very strong focus from right across the world, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from the private sector perspective as well. And I think we're encouraged that there are a load of different collaborative platforms that have sprung up in the run-up to COP26. So one example would be a collaboration around how can we make genuine assessments about how well positioned companies' physical assets are in the face of climate change. I think, and that particularly intrigues me, because a lot of the industry's efforts are focused around mitigation. We're all looking at how we can stop and prevent the climate crisis from coming. And I think the reality is that we're too late. We're already in it. And so adaptation now needs to come up to the fore. We need to look at how we can make the existing stock of assets we have physically resilient in the face of extreme weather events that are already affecting many of us around the world. And companies, as owners of these assets, have a clear responsibility to make sure that their assets are as robust as they can be. And the challenge for us as an industry is, how do we measure that? How do we get access to that physical data around those assets, and how do we make assessments around how those assets are climate proofed effectively? And there's a really interesting project involving both public and private actors aimed at doing that. And then secondarily to that, once you make that assessment, what are the investments you need to make in order to ensure that those any gaps are filled? And that financing for those investments comes from a combination of public and private sources, because it is both a private good and a public good that our assets are resilient.
Great, thank you. I think we are out of time. If I could summarize, we've tried to cover in this panel the foundational question of what we mean by climate accounting, both from the perspective of the impact on the climate and the impact the financial system can have by its investments in reducing the impact on the climate and adaptation to climate change. And Martin, I think, gave us a great overview of what he thinks a system for climate accounting might look like. And we've all explored with you how we think we might be able to use technology, using especially pilots and investments, to develop a collaboration between the public and private sector to accelerate this ability to measure and reduce the impact on the climate from the financial system. And with that, I think we're out of time. I wanted to thank my fellow panelists for participating today. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I hope you found this panel useful. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Brian, for leading this discussion and extracting some pretty clear takeaways from this panel on climate accounting.